I sat at that gleaming oak table in the River North Steakhouse, my fingers clutching my mother's old quilt in my lap, when my daughter Lena walked in on Daniel's arm, her smile tight, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to disappear. He snapped at the waiter over red wine, grabbed her wrist. Under the table, and when his father laughed and said, "She needs to learn her place," I saw the yellow-green bruises bloom beneath her sleeve. My stomach dropped. I'd seen this before, not with her, but with my own mother, with myself. They thought they were in control, that I'd stay quiet like always. But they didn't know I'd already made up my mind that night to burn their lies to the ground. Friends, before we dive into this story, I want to ask for a small favor. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or trapped by someone else's version of your life, please subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your voice matters, and I'm so glad you're here. I sat at that gleaming oak table in the River North Steakhouse, my fingers tracing the edge of my mother's quilt folded in my lap, when Lena walked in on Daniel's arm, her smile tight, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to disappear. The restaurant hummed with low chatter, silverware clinking, soft jazz weaving through the air, but all I heard was my own pulse thudding in my ears the second I saw her. She wore a beige dress with tiny flowers, too plain for the woman who used to pick out bold patterns that matched her laugh. Her hair was pulled back so tightly, it looked painful. Daniel held her elbow like he owned it, like he owned her. She kissed my cheek quickly, lips cold, perfume too sweet, hiding something underneath. "You look nice, Mom," she said, but her voice was thin, like paper about to tear. I wanted to pull her into my arms right then, but Daniel sat her down like she was a china doll, not a person. He didn't even push her chair in. He just dropped her into it and turned to his phone. I clutched the quilt tighter. This wasn't just dinner. Something was wrong, and I already knew I wouldn't be able to pretend otherwise. The waiter came over almost too fast, probably, sensing the tension rolling off our table like heat. Daniel ordered whiskey neat. No ice, no small talk. Richard, already loud and red-faced from the parking lot, barked for a double. Lena hesitated. "White wine?" she asked, looking at Daniel like she needed permission. He didn't look up from his phone. "Whatever," he muttered. She took a breath and said, "Red wine, please." That's when everything tilted. Daniel's head snapped up. "Red?" His voice dropped, sharp as glass. "I ordered fish. You know red doesn't go with fish." Lena flinched like he'd slapped her. "Sorry, honey, I didn't think." "You never think," he said, and the waiter froze, pen hovering. My throat tightened. I tried to lighten it. "Oh, come on, it's just wine." But before I could finish, Richard let out that raspy laugh of his and said, "Leave it, Evelyn. She needs to learn her place." Lena's hand moved to cover her wrist, but not fast enough. Her sleeve slid back just an inch, and there they were. Finger-shaped bruises, yellow fading to green, healing, but not gone. My stomach dropped. I'd seen that color before, on my own arms, on my mother's, that exact shade of shame. And just like that, the silence I'd carried for 30 years cracked open. I didn't plan what came next. My body moved before my brain caught up. I stood so fast, my chair screeched against the floor, and every head in that half of the restaurant turned toward us. Lena's eyes locked onto mine, wide, panicked, pleading. "Don't," they said. "Please, don't make it worse." But I'd spent my whole life making things not worse by staying quiet, by pretending, by swallowing every scream until I thought I'd choke on them. Not this time. "You're coming home with me tonight," I said, loud enough that the couple at the next table stopped. Chewing. Daniel stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "What are you talking about?" he said, voice low, dangerous. "She's my wife. She's my daughter-in-law," I shot back, "and she's not staying with a man who grabs her under the table like she's a disobedient dog." Lena's face crumpled. She shook her head fast, tears already spilling. "Mom, no, it's fine, really. He's just stressed." But I saw it. The way her fingers trembled in her lap, the way she kept glancing at Richard like he might jump in with another cruel joke. And I knew I couldn't sit down. Not now. Not ever again. I reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was ice cold. "Get your purse," I said. "We're leaving." Daniel stood up then, his chair toppling backward with a crash that echoed through the room. "You don't get to decide that," he hissed. "This is our marriage, our life. You think you know what's going on?" His voice rose just enough that people at nearby tables turned their heads discreetly, pretending not to watch. Richard leaned back, arms crossed, smirking like this was entertainment. "She's overreacting," he said to no one in particular. "Women always do." I ignored him. My eyes stayed on Lena. "Do you want to stay?" I asked her, quiet but firm. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Tears rolled down her cheeks, silent and steady. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But she didn't pull her hand away either. That was enough. "Get your things," I said again. She stood slowly, like every muscle ached, and grabbed her purse from the floor. Daniel stepped in front of her. "She's not going anywhere." He sounded calm now, which scared me more than the yelling. "She's carrying my child, Evelyn. Think about what you're doing." My breath caught. Pregnant. I hadn't known. But that made it worse, not better. I looked at Lena's flat stomach under that too big dress, then back at her face, so young, so tired, so lost. "Then you should have treated her like someone worth protecting," I said, "not like something you own." Lena moved like a ghost, sliding past Daniel without touching him. He didn't stop her. Maybe because people were watching. Maybe because he knew this wasn't a fight he could win with force right now. I kept my hand on her back as we walked past the host stand, past the bar, out the heavy glass doors into the cool Chicago night. Rain had started. Falling fine mist that clung to my skin. I didn't have an umbrella. Didn't care. We reached my car and she stopped, leaning against the passenger door like her legs might give out. "I shouldn't have let you do that," she whispered. "He's going to be furious." "Let him be furious," I said, unlocking the car. "He doesn't get to decide what's acceptable anymore." She got in slowly, clutching her purse like it was a shield. I started the engine and turned on the heater without asking. She was shivering. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of everything unsaid. The years I'd ignored, the signs, the excuses I'd made for him, the way I'd told myself he wasn't like his father. But he was. Worse, maybe, because he hid it better. And I'd let it happen. Now, all I could do was drive. Drive her away from that table, that restaurant, that life. Not as a mother-in-law, not as a guest at someone else's family drama, but as the only person who saw her and chose her. By the time we pulled into my driveway, the rain had soaked through my hair and down my neck, but I didn't feel cold anymore. Lena hadn't spoken the whole drive, just stared out the window like she was watching. Her old life disappear in the rear view. I turned off the car and faced her. "You don't have to say anything tonight," I said. "You can sleep in the guest room. Take a hot shower, eat something if you're hungry, or not, whatever you need." She finally looked at me, eyes red-rimmed, lips chapped. "He's going to call," she said. "He's going to say it was my fault, that I embarrassed him." "Let him call," I said. "I'll answer." She shook her head. "You don't understand. He'll make it harder. For the baby." I reached over and took her hand again. "Then we'll be harder back." She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders relaxed. Just a fraction. Enough. I walked her to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped aside. She crossed the threshold slowly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't just offering her a place to sleep. I was offering her a chance to breathe, to remember who she was before he made her small, and maybe, just maybe, to start becoming her again. By the time we shut the door behind us, I wasn't just Evelyn the widow, the quiet mother-in-law who kept her opinions to herself. I was the woman who finally stood up. And that changed everything. I unlocked my front door at 10 p.m., heart still hammering, and watched Lena step inside like she'd crossed a border into enemy territory. The street lamp outside cast long shadows down the hallway, and she moved like she was afraid of making noise, like even the sound of her own footsteps might bring trouble. Her heels clicked once, then she slipped them off without being asked, placing them neatly by the mat as if she were a guest in a museum, not my home. I took her coat, but she kept her sweater on, zipped all the way up despite the humid June night. "Spare room's ready," I said, trying to keep my voice light. She nodded, her eyes darting around the living room like she was memorizing every exit. I put the kettle on, not because I thought she'd drink it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. When I handed her the mug, she wrapped both palms around it like it was the only thing holding her together, but didn't take a sip. "You don't have to talk," I said. She whispered, "Thank you," and that was it. No more words, just the sound of her breathing too fast, too shallow. She wouldn't look at me, not really. Her gaze would flick up for half a second, then drop back to her lap, or the floor, or the steam rising from the untouched tea. I sat across from her on the couch, close enough to help, far enough not to crowd her. "Lena," I said finally, soft but steady. "Has he done this before?" Her whole body tensed. She swallowed hard, fingers tightening around the mug. "It's not like that, Evelyn. He's stressed. He loves me." The words came out rehearsed, like she'd said them to herself 100 times in the mirror. I wanted to grab her shoulders and shake the truth out of her. Tell her love doesn't leave fingerprints on your wrist, doesn't make you flinch at the sound of a chair scraping. But I just nodded, said, "Okay," because pushing her would only make her retreat. I remembered that look, the way she turned inward, folded herself small. I'd worn that same expression for years during my marriage to Richard. She wasn't lying, she was surviving. And right then, I understood. She didn't believe she deserved better. She believed this was the price of being loved. I showed her the guest room. Fresh sheets, clean towels, the window open just a crack so the night air could slip in. "Bathroom's down the hall," I said. "There's extra toothbrushes under the sink." She murmured thanks again and closed the door softly behind her. I went back to the kitchen, washed my own mug, wiped down the counter even though it didn't need it. My mind wouldn't stop racing. What would Daniel do now? Would he call? Show up? And Richard? God, he'd side with his son, no question. He always did. I leaned against the sink and stared out the window at the dark street. A car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the ceiling for a second before fading. My chest ached. I'd just pulled Lena out of that dinner, out of that life, but I hadn't asked myself what came next. If she stayed, I'd be choosing her over my own son, not just disagreeing with him, cutting him off. And maybe that's exactly what I needed to do. But the thought made my stomach twist. Mothers aren't supposed to pick sides, except when one side is hurting the other. Hours later, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, too still. I got up, padded down the hallway. The guest room door was open just a sliver. No light. But then I heard water running in the kitchen. I found her there, standing at the sink in the same clothes, scrubbing the same coffee cup over and over like it was covered in something she couldn't wash off. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, tears dripping into the soapy water. She didn't hear me come in. "Lena," I said gently. She jumped, nearly dropping the cup, wiped her face with the back of her wrist like that could erase everything. "I couldn't sleep," she mumbled. "I thought I'd clean up." "It's fine," I said. "Leave it." She didn't move, just stood there, hands gripping the edge of the sink like it was the only thing keeping her upright. In that moment, I saw it. Not just fear, but the awful, paralyzing conflict inside her. She knew it was wrong. She knew she was in danger. But leaving meant uncertainty, shame, maybe losing her home, her status, her future, and worse, losing the dream of who she thought Daniel was. She wasn't staying because she was weak. She was staying because leaving felt like freefall. I didn't touch her, didn't offer empty comfort, just stood beside her and said, "You don't have to decide anything tonight." She nodded, still not looking at me. "He's going to call tomorrow," she whispered. "He'll say it was my fault, that I embarrassed him in front of his father. "Let him call," I said. "I'll answer." She shook her head fast. "You don't understand. He'll make it harder. For the baby." My breath caught. "Baby?" She pressed a hand to her stomach, eyes wide like she hadn't meant to say it. Then, softer, "I'm 3 months pregnant." I felt like the floor had shifted under me. All the reasons she couldn't leave just got heavier. A child meant courts, custody battles, shared holidays, decades of forced contact. It also meant Daniel had even more power over her, more leverage, more ways to punish her if she tried to go. But it also meant she had even more to fight for. I wanted to tell her that, but I knew now wasn't the time. So I just turned off the faucet, took the cup from her hands, and set it on the counter. "Go back to bed," I said. "I'll be right here if you need anything." She nodded and walked away, her steps slow, exhausted, and I stayed in that kitchen, staring at the dark window, realizing with chilling clarity that helping her wouldn't just cost me my relationship with Daniel, it might cost me everything. My name in the family, my place at holidays, my identity as a mother who kept the peace. But peace built on silence isn't peace. It's surrender. And I was done. By the time I finally crawled into bed, dawn was starting to gray the edges of the blinds. I lay there listening to the house, the hum of the fridge, the creak of old wood, Lena's muffled breathing down the hall. My mind kept looping. What if I'd stayed quiet at that table? What if I'd just nodded and let her go home with him? She might have been safe from confrontation, but not from harm, and I would have lived with that guilt forever. No, I'd done the only thing I could, but doing the right thing didn't make it easy. It just made it necessary. I thought about the baby, tiny, unaware, already caught in this web. I thought about Lena washing that cup like she could scrub away the shame. And I knew then that my job wasn't to fix her, or convince her, or even protect her in the way I wanted to. My job was to be there, steady, open, ready, when she finally chose herself. Even if that took months, even if it took years, and even if it meant losing my son forever, because some doors once opened can't be closed. And this one, this quiet, trembling act of bringing her home, had just changed everything. I woke up at 3 a.m. sweating, the sheets twisted around my legs like ropes, my heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The image of Lena's bruised wrist kept flashing behind my eyelids, yellow fading to green, the shape of fingers wrapped too tight. And it pulled me straight back, to my mother's kitchen when I was 12, watching her dab concealer over a black eye while humming a hymn like nothing was wrong. "He didn't mean it," she'd say, smoothing her hair back into place with shaking hands. "He was just upset." I believed her. For years, I believed that love, sometimes, came with bruises. That silence was the price you paid for keeping a family together. I got up, bare feet cold on the hardwood, and walked to the closet in the guest room. Lena was still asleep down the hall, and pulled out the old photo album I hadn't opened in decades. It was the one from my wedding day. There I was in my ivory dress, smiling like I'd won the lottery. And there was Richard, with his arm around my waist, grinning like he hadn't spent our honeymoon screaming at me because I ordered room service too late. He looked like a normal man, a good husband. But I remembered the truth. He'd thrown a wine glass at the wall that night, called me useless, told me I'd never be enough. And I stayed. I sat on the edge of the bed with the album open on my lap, turning pages like they were evidence. There was a shot of my mother at the reception, standing beside Richard, her smile tight, her posture stiff. She knew. She'd seen it in his eyes before I ever did. And still, she handed me off to him like it was a promotion instead of a sentence. "Men like your father don't change," she'd told me the night before the wedding, her voice low and tired. "You either learn to live with it, or you end up alone." I'd nodded like a good daughter, like a woman who understood the rules. Now those same words were echoing in Lena's voice. "He's stressed. He loves me." It wasn't an excuse. It was a script, one passed down through generations of women who thought suffering was loyalty. I closed the album, my throat tight. I couldn't let that script play out again, not with Lena, not while I still had breath in my lungs. The sky outside was still dark, but a pale gray line was starting to bleed along the horizon. Morning was coming, and with it, a chance to say the words I should have said years. Ego. I made coffee before the sun rose, the kitchen quiet except for the gurgle of the machine and the hum of the fridge. Lena came in around 6:30, wrapped in one of my old robes, her hair messy, her face pale. She didn't say anything, just poured herself a cup and sat at the table, eyes down, fingers tracing the rim of her mug. I sat across from her, the silence thick between us. I didn't ask how she slept. I didn't tell her it was going to be okay. I just looked at her and said, "My husband did the same thing to me. For years." And I stayed. Her head snapped up like I'd slapped her. For the first time since she walked into that steakhouse, she really looked at me, eyes wide, searching, trembling. Not with fear this time, but with recognition, like she'd been walking in the dark and suddenly saw another person holding a lantern. "You," she whispered. I nodded. Worse on some days than others. He'd shove me into walls, call me names, say I was lucky he put up with me, and I told myself it wasn't that bad, that other women had it worse, that I'd made a vow. Her breath hitched. Did he ever hit you in front of people?" "No," I said. "He was smarter than that. But your husband, he's not even trying to hide it anymore." She started to cry then, not the quiet tears from the night before, but deep, shuddering sobs that shook her whole body. She didn't cover her face. She didn't look away. She just let it out, like she'd been holding it in for so long she couldn't carry it another second. I didn't reach for her. I didn't say a word. I just stayed there, solid, present, letting her feel safe enough to fall apart. After a while, she wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and said, "I thought I was the only one who felt like this." "You're not," I said. "Not even close." She took a shaky breath, then stood up slowly. Without a word, she pulled off the oversized sweater she'd been living in since she got here. Underneath, she wore a thin tank top. She turned sideways and lifted the fabric just enough for me to see. The bruises on her ribs were dark, purple, layered over older ones that had turned brown. On her back, near her shoulder blade, there was a hand-shaped mark still swollen. My stomach turned. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to drive straight to Daniel's house and make him feel 1 ounce of what he'd done. But I stayed still, because this wasn't about my rage. It was about her truth. And for the first time, she was giving it to me, not as a secret, but as a plea. I didn't touch her, didn't hug her. Not yet. I just said, "Thank you for showing me." She nodded, tears still falling, but her shoulders were already a little straighter, like a weight had shifted. She pulled her sweater back on, but not like armor this time, more like a choice. "I didn't want to believe it was abuse," she said softly, sitting back down. "I kept thinking if I just loved him better, worked harder, stayed quieter, he'd go back to the man I married." "I thought the same thing," I told her. "For 10 years. She looked at me like she couldn't understand how I'd survived it. "How did you leave?" "I didn't," I admitted. "He left me, got bored, moved on to someone else, and I spent the next 20 years wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I hadn't been enough to make him stay. But really, it was because I wasn't enough to make him stop. That's when it hit me. I'd never forgiven myself for not fighting back, for not walking out when I still could, for letting him steal years of my life while I pretended it was love. Now, watching Lena sit across from me, broken but not gone, I realized helping her wasn't just about saving her. It was about finally forgiving myself for surviving. We sat there for a long time after that, just breathing, the coffee going cold between us. Outside, birds started singing. A car passed on the street. Life kept moving, but something inside me had settled. The shame I'd carried, the belief that I should have known better, done better, didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. Because Lena wasn't weak. She was trapped. And I hadn't been weak either. I'd been trained to believe silence was strength. But real strength was this: the courage to say it out loud, to show the bruises, to name the truth. "You don't have to decide anything today," I told her finally. "But you don't have to hide from me. Ever." She reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was still cold, but her grip was firm. And in that small touch, I felt something shift. Not just in her, but in me. The cycle didn't have to keep turning. Not this time. Not with us. And for the first time in decades, I believed that maybe it wasn't too late to make things right. Not just for her, but for the woman I used to be. And the woman I was finally becoming. Daniel called the next morning, voice calm, polite. "Mom, you embarrassed Lena. She's upset. She wants to come home." I stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, sunlight streaming through the window like everything was normal, like last night hadn't shattered something forever. His tone was smooth, practiced, like he'd rehearsed this exact script. "She's crying," he added softly. "Says she doesn't know what came over her last night. She regrets leaving." My fingers tightened around the phone. Part of me, the part that still remembered being 30, scared, and married to a man who said, "I'm sorry," after slamming my head into the wall, wanted to believe him, wanted to think maybe it really was a misunderstanding. Maybe Lena had overreacted. Maybe I'd made everything worse by dragging her out of that restaurant like some kind of vigilante. I opened my mouth to say I'd talk to her, that I'd give her the phone, that I'd let her decide. But then I saw her. Lena stood in the hallway, barefoot in one of my old sweatshirts, eyes wide, shaking her head fast, silently, tears already spilling down her cheeks. And I knew. I said, "She's not coming back until you get help." He laughed, short, cold, like I'd told a bad joke. "This is none of your business. She's my wife." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just said, "Then you should have treated her like someone worth protecting," and hung up before he could twist the conversation again. But not before I heard him mutter under his breath, "You're just jealous you're alone now." The words landed like a punch, not because they hurt, but because they showed me exactly who he was, a man who couldn't stand losing control, who saw love as ownership, and who thought my being alone made me weak instead of free. I turned off the phone and set it on the counter like it was contaminated. Lena hadn't moved. She was still in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, shoulders hunched like she was trying to vanish into the walls. "He's going to keep calling," I said. She nodded, voice barely a whisper. "He always does. Then we'll stop." Answering. She didn't argue, just walked into the living room and curled up on the couch like a child who'd given up being seen. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, but I didn't know if that was true. Not yet. All I knew was I wouldn't let him rewrite what happened last night. I wouldn't let him make her feel crazy for wanting to live without fear. The rest of the day passed in heavy silence. Lena barely spoke. She ate a few bites of toast, drank half a cup of tea, then went to the guest room and closed the door. I cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, pretended normalcy, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. What if he showed up? What if he called her friends, her family, told them I'd brainwashed her? What if he filed some legal complaint, claimed I was interfering? I'd seen it before. Men using the system like a weapon while women were told to stay out of family matters. Around 3 p.m., I heard the washing machine finish its cycle. I went down to the basement to switch the load. Lena's clothes were in there, soft blouses, leggings, the sweater she'd worn to dinner. I pulled them out, shaking each piece before tossing it into the dryer. That's when I felt it, a crumpled piece of paper stuffed deep in the pocket of her jeans. I smoothed it out. It was a doctor's note dated 3 weeks ago. Patient presence with multiple contusions, consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. My breath caught. Below that, in smaller print, patient stated injuries resulted from falling. Downstairs, recommended follow-up, patient declined. She'd lied, not to protect him. She'd lied to protect herself from more questions, more judgment, more pressure to explain the unexplainable. She'd walked into a clinic with bruises, told the easiest story, and walked out alone again, carrying the truth like a stone in her chest. I stood there in the basement, the dryer humming beside me, the paper trembling in my hands. I didn't cry. Not yet. A hot, sharp rage rose up from deep in my gut, not at Lena, never at her, but at Daniel for doing this, at the nurse who accepted, fell down the stairs, without looking her in the eyes, at the world that teaches women to minimize their pain so others can stay comfortable. How many times had I done the same? Told my mother I'd tripped when Richard shoved me into the doorframe? Said I banged into the cabinet when my arm was black and blue? We lie because the truth costs too much. People don't want to believe the man they admire, the son they raised, the husband they love, is capable of cruelty. So we swallow it. We hide it. We make ourselves small to keep the peace. But peace built on silence isn't peace. It's complicity. I folded the note carefully and put it back in the pocket. I wouldn't confront Lena yet. She wasn't ready, but I would keep it. Not as proof against her, but as proof that she'd been trying to survive long before last night. And maybe, just maybe, that note would be the thing that finally convinced her she wasn't crazy, that what she'd endured was real, and that she didn't have to hide it anymore. That evening I made soup, simple tomato, with crusty bread. Lena came out of her room around 6 p.m., hair damp from a shower, eyes red but dry. She sat at the table without saying a word. I handed her a bowl. She took it, wrapped her hands around it like the warmth could reach the cold inside her. "Daniel called again," I said quietly. Her whole body tensed. "Left a message. Said you left your favorite necklace at the house, that he'll bring it by tomorrow if you text him." She didn't look up. "I don't care." "About the necklace." "I know." We ate in silence for a while. Then she said, so soft I almost missed it, "He's going to tell everyone I'm unstable, that I'm having a breakdown." "Let him," I said. "Truth doesn't need his permission to be real." She finally met my eyes. "What if no one believes me?" "Then they're not the people you need." She nodded slowly, like she was trying to hold on to that idea. After dinner, she helped me load the dishwasher. As she reached for a plate, the sleeve of her sweatshirt slid up, and I saw it. A fresh bruise, purple at the center, fading to yellow at the edges. Right on her forearm. She yanked the fabric down immediately. I didn't say anything, just finished wiping the counter. But inside I was screaming. Not from sadness, from fury, because she was still hiding, still protecting him, still believing the lie that if she just stayed quiet, everything would be okay. Later that night, after Lena went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the doctor's note in front of me, a cup of cold tea beside it. I read it again and again, each word burning into my mind. Repeated blunt force trauma. Not an accident, not a fall. Violence, deliberate, ongoing. And she'd hidden it. She'd walked around with that paper in her pocket like a secret she was ashamed of carrying. I finally let the tears come, not tears of pity, but of rage so deep it felt like fire in my veins. I was angry at Daniel for thinking he could mark her body and still call it love. Angry at the system that lets men like him walk free while women are told to work things out. Angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, for believing he was just stressed, for thinking maybe I was overreacting. But most of all, I was angry at the unspoken rule so many of us learn, that a woman's pain is a burden unless it's convenient, that her suffering should be neat, quiet, and never inconvenient to the people around her. Lena wasn't just hiding from Daniel. She was hiding from a world that rewards silence and punishes truth. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let her carry this alone anymore. Even if she wasn't ready to speak, I would be ready to listen. Even if she still believed the lie, I would hold the truth for her, until she could hold it herself. I drove Lena to the Women's Center downtown, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Rain had started again, light but steady, smearing the windshield into a blur of gray and streetlight. The wipers scraped back and forth like a ticking clock, counting down to something. Neither of us knew how to face. Lena sat in the passenger seat with her arms folded across her stomach, eyes fixed on the passing buildings, her breath fogging the window in short, nervous bursts. She hadn't said a word since we left the house. Not turn left, not slow down, not even I don't want to go. Just silence, thick and heavy, like she was holding her whole self in. I didn't turn the radio on, didn't try to fill the quiet with reassurances. I wasn't sure I believed myself. When we pulled up to the red brick building with the discreet sign, Hope Horizon, support for women and families, I put the car in park and shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt louder than the rain. "We're here," I said softly. She didn't move, just stared at the front door like it was a judge's bench. She sat there for a full minute, unmoving, before she finally spoke, barely above a whisper, like she was afraid the words might shatter. "If I go in there," she said, "it becomes real. And if it's real, I have to leave him. And I don't know how." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hugged herself tighter, like she was holding pieces of herself together. I looked at her, really, looked, and saw the terror behind her eyes, the kind that doesn't come from one bad night, but from months, maybe years, of walking on eggshells, of shrinking herself to fit into a life that was slowly smothering her. I wanted to say, "You don't have to decide today," or "They'll just talk." No. Pressure. But I knew empty comfort wouldn't help, so I didn't push. I didn't even unbuckle my seatbelt. I just leaned back, turned off the headlights, and said, "Then we'll sit." And we did. The rain kept falling. Cars passed. People walked in and out of the center. Some alone, some with kids, some holding hands with friends. Lena watched them like she was watching a language she once knew, but had forgotten how to speak. An hour passed. Maybe more. My legs got stiff. My back ached. But I didn't move. I let the silence stretch, let the car fill with the sound of our breathing, the drum of rain. On metal, the occasional honk from the street. I watched Lena's face in my peripheral vision, the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers tapped her elbow, the way her eyes kept darting to the door and then back to her lap like she was arguing with herself. Once, she reached for the door handle, then pulled her hand back fast, like it burned. I stayed quiet. I remembered doing the same thing years ago, parked outside a clinic, too scared to go in, convinced that if I just stayed in the car, I could pretend none of it was happening. I'd waited until my body gave out from the stress before I finally asked for help. I wouldn't make her feel rushed. Healing doesn't start with a grand gesture. It starts with a breath, a glance, a moment of truth you can barely hold. And then finally, she leaned forward, not to open the door, but to pick up the folded brochure someone had left on the dash. During a previous visit, she smoothed it out on her lap, read the front, flipped it over, traced the hotline number with her thumb. She didn't go inside, didn't speak to anyone. But when we got back home, she left the brochure on the kitchen counter right next to the coffee maker, like a bookmark in her own story. I didn't mention it, didn't say a word. But that night, around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I opened it, half expecting another polite text saying, "Good night" or "Thanks for today." Instead, there was a photo. Just one. No message, no caption at first. I tapped to enlarge it. It was her arm, her left forearm, turned outward. Fresh bruises bloomed along her skin, dark purple at the center, already yellowing at the edges. And in the corner of the image, clear as day, the timestamp, June 12th, and below it, typed in plain letters, June 12th. That was all. No, "Look, what he did." No, "I'm scared." No plea for advice, just proof. Cold, undeniable, raw. My throat closed up. I wanted to call her, to run down the hall and hold her, to scream at the sky for letting this happen to a woman who'd once lit up a room with her laugh. But I didn't. I just saved the photo to a private folder on my phone, backed it up to cloud storage, and labeled it with her name and the date. Because whether she knew it or not, she'd just taken her first real step. Not toward me, not toward safety yet, but toward truth. I lay there in the dark after that, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image in my mind. I remembered Richard doing the same to me, grabbing my arm hard enough to leave marks I'd hide under cardigans, then saying, You made me do that. I'd never taken a photo, never kept evidence. I'd washed it away in the shower, scrubbed until my skin was red, told myself it wasn't that bad. But Lena, she was documenting it. Even if she wasn't ready to leave, even if she still believed she might go back, she was saying, this happened. And that was huge. That was revolutionary. Because abuse thrives in silence, in doubt, in the gray areas where people say, but he's such a good guy. A photo like that? It cuts through the noise. It says, this is not gray. This is black and blue. I didn't know if she'd ever file a report. Didn't know if she'd ever walk into that center again. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't wait for her to ask for help before I stepped in. Not like I had with myself. Not like my mother had with me. This time, I'd be ready. Ready to drive her anywhere. Ready to testify. Ready to stand between her and danger. Even if it meant losing my son forever. Because love shouldn't cost your safety. And I'd rather lose a family built on lies than watch the woman I love disappear into one. The next morning, I made breakfast. Oatmeal with berries, toast, coffee, and set a plate for her on the table. She came in wearing one of my old sweatshirts, her hair loose for the first time since she'd arrived. She didn't mention the photo. Didn't ask if I'd seen it. But she didn't hide her arms either. She ate slowly, quietly, but her shoulders weren't hunched. Her hands didn't tremble. And when she handed me her empty mug, her fingers brushed mine, not by accident, but on purpose. A quiet, thank you. A silent, I'm still here. I didn't say anything, just nodded. But inside, I felt something shift. Not because she'd healed, she hadn't. Not yet. But because she'd stopped pretending it wasn't happening. And that was the beginning. Not the end. Not justice, not freedom, not even safety yet. But the first real crack in the wall she'd built around herself. And I'd be there, right beside her, for every brick she pulled down after that. I was at the grocery store when I saw Daniel's black SUV pull in, its tires crunching over the wet pavement from last night's rain. My stomach clenched so hard I nearly dropped the carton of eggs I'd just picked up. I froze in the produce aisle, fingers curling around the cold plastic container, watching him kill the engine and slam the door like he owned the lot. He scanned the front of the store, sharp-eyed, impatient. And when his gaze landed on me, it locked on like a missile finding its target. My throat went dry. I could have turned and walked away, ducked into another aisle, pretended I hadn't seen him, but something in me refused to hide anymore. So I stood my ground, heart hammering against my ribs, and watched him stride toward me like I was the one who'd wronged him. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp, the kind he wore when he wanted to impress. You're turning her against me, he said, voice low but cutting. You're poisoning her mind. I didn't flinch. Didn't look down like I used to with Richard. Instead, I set the eggs gently in the cart and met his eyes straight on. No, Daniel, I said, voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. I'm just showing her she deserves better than fear. He let out a short, bitter laugh and stepped closer, close enough that I could see the vein pulsing in his temple. You think you're the hero? He hissed, voice dropping so only I could hear. You're the reason she's miserable now. You broke our family. The words hit like a slap, not because they were true, but because they echoed everything Richard used to say to me. For a split second, I felt 25 again, small, fragile, drowning in guilt for daring to want more than silence and bruises. My chest tightened, and I almost apologized, almost said, I didn't mean to, like I'd done 1,000 times before. But then I remembered Lena's hands trembling as she washed that coffee cup, the way she flinched at slamming doors, the silent tears she cried when she thought no one was watching. And I knew this wasn't about him feeling wronged. It was about her finally feeling seen. I took a slow breath, grounding myself in that truth. You broke your family the day you decided fear was part of love, I said, quiet but firm. Not me. His jaw twitched. He glanced around like he was checking if Anyone was watching, because men like him only show their teeth when they think no one's filming. "She's pregnant," he said, voice softer now, almost pleading. "Do you really want her raising our kid without a father?" The manipulation was so transparent, it made me sick. He wasn't worried about the baby. He was worried about control, about losing the image of the perfect family he'd built to hide the rot underneath. "She's not raising your child without a father," I said. "She's protecting your child from one." He stiffened. For a second, his mask slipped, just enough to show the rage beneath. But he caught himself fast, smoothing his expression like he'd rehearsed this moment. "You don't know what goes on in my house," he said. "You never did." "Maybe not," I said. "But I know what happened at that restaurant. And I know what those bruises looked like. And I know a woman who's been taught to call pain love when it's really just ownership." He leaned in, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the same eyes he'd inherited from Richard. "You'll regret this," he said, voice low and smooth like syrup over poison. "You think you're saving her, but you're just dragging her into a war she never asked for." I almost laughed. "She didn't ask for it," I said. "But she's been living it for months, maybe years. You don't get to decide what she's ready for, Daniel. She's not your property." He stared at me like he'd never really seen me before, as if I'd been wallpaper all these years, and suddenly I'd stepped out of the frame. And maybe I had. Maybe that's what terrified him most, not that Lena might leave, but that I'd finally stopped pretending I didn't see. He stepped back, jaw tight, hands shoved in his coat pockets like he was stopping himself from doing something worse. "You used to be reasonable," he muttered. "What happened to you?" "I remembered who I was," I said. "And I remembered what my mother taught me, by her silence. I won't make the same mistake." He turned to walk away, shoulders rigid, but paused just before reaching his SUV. Without looking back, he said, "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. I just watched him get into his car, start the engine, and peel out of the lot like the whole world owed him an apology. My hands were still shaking, but not from fear, from clarity. That old voice inside me, the one that whispered, "Stay quiet, keep peace, don't rock the boat," was finally quiet. And in its place was something stronger. Certainty. I picked up my cart again, pushed it toward the checkout, and didn't look back. But as I waited in line, eggs cold in my hands, one thought settled deep in my chest. I did. Regret one thing. Only one. Not standing up to him, not taking Lena in, not speaking the truth. No, I regretted waiting so long to do it. I regretted every birthday I smiled through, every holiday I pretended, every time I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. Because silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity, and I was done being complicit. Richard showed up at my door unannounced, suit wrinkled, eyes bloodshot. I was halfway through folding laundry when I saw his silhouette through the peephole, and my stomach dropped like a stone. It had been years since he'd set foot near my house. I almost slammed the door in his face. Part of me still flinched at the sound of his voice, even after all this time, but something in his posture stopped me. He wasn't standing tall like he used to, chest puffed out like the world owed him respect. He looked small, defeated. "I heard what's going on," he said, voice rough. "You're stirring up trouble again." My jaw tightened. If helping Lena is trouble, then yes, I'm guilty. He didn't argue, just shifted his weight, glanced past me into the hallway like he was searching for something. "Lena came to me last week," he said quietly. "Said she was scared." My blood ran cold. Had she gone? Back to him? Had she told him everything? Panic clawed up my throat, but before I could speak, he added, voice cracking like dry wood. "I told her to leave him. I told her to run." I stared at him, stunned. This wasn't the Richard I knew, the man who once laughed while his son grabbed his wife's wrist in public, the man who called that discipline. But here he stood, eyes wet, shoulders slumped, looking more like a ghost than a father. I stepped aside without a word, and he walked in like he belonged there, like he hadn't spent 20 years pretending he was perfect while the rest of us cleaned up his messes. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd shared toast with Lena at dawn just days ago, and ran a hand over his face. "I did the same to your mother," he said, not looking at me. "And to you, and I've spent 20 years trying to forget it." The words hit like a gut punch. I'd waited decades to hear that sentence. Not for forgiveness, because I'd stopped needing that a long time ago, but just to know he saw it, that he hadn't rewritten history in his head like so many men do. He wasn't asking for absolution. He wasn't making excuses. He just sat there, hollowed out, finally facing the truth. "I thought keeping quiet was strength," he muttered, "but it was just cowardice." I didn't say anything, didn't offer tea or comfort. I just leaned against the counter and let him sit in the weight of what he'd done. Because for once, he was carrying it instead of passing it down to the next woman in line. He looked up then, eyes red-rimmed but steady. "If she files," he said, voice low but firm, "I'll testify. About Daniel, about me, about the whole damn cycle." My breath caught. That was more than an apology. It was an offering, a weapon. He wasn't just admitting his own sins. He was volunteering to help break the pattern that had poisoned our family for generations. "Why now?" I asked, because I needed to know. Was this guilt, late-stage regret, or something real? He sighed, long and heavy. "Lena looked at me the same way your mother used to, like she was already gone, just her body still walking around." He swallowed hard. "I couldn't watch another woman disappear like that, not when I have a chance to stop it." I studied his face, searching for the old arrogance, the charm he used to manipulate everyone into looking the other way. But it wasn't there, just exhaustion, grief, maybe even shame. And for the first time, I believed him. Not because he deserved to be believed, but because his pain finally matched the harm he'd caused. That mattered. Not for him, but for Lena, for the truth. I went to the sink and filled a glass with water, my hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, from the sheer disbelief that this moment was real. Richard, the man who once told me, "Wives don't talk back," was now offering to stand in court and say, "I was wrong, he's wrong, this stops here." I handed him the glass. He took it with a nod, fingers brushing mine, brief, impersonal, but charged with everything we'd never said. "Do you think she'll file?" he asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But if she does, she'll need witnesses who aren't afraid to speak. People who won't say it's a private matter or he's under stress." He nodded, slowly. "Then I'll be ready." We sat in silence for a while, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between us. No grand reconciliation, no tearful reunion, just two people who'd survived the same storm, finally agreeing that the rain had done enough damage. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to build something that wouldn't leak. After he left, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just stood in the quiet kitchen, staring at the chair where he'd sat, trying to reconcile the man who'd just been here with the monster I'd carried in my memory for decades. It wasn't that I forgave him. Forgiveness wasn't the point. The point was that he'd finally named the thing that had lived in our house like a third guest at every meal. Control disguised as care, violence dressed up as love. And in naming it, he'd handed Lena a lifeline. That night, I went to my bedroom and opened the small wooden box on my dresser, the one I kept for things too precious to lose. Inside was my mother's wedding ring, the one I'd slipped into her casket the day we buried her, then dug up months later because I couldn't bear to leave it underground with all her unspoken pain. I held it in my palm, the gold warm from my skin, and traced the thin band with my thumb. She'd worn it for 30 years while he broke her spirit, and she never took it off. Not even when he shoved her into the wall the night I graduated high school. Now holding it, I finally understood. The ring wasn't a symbol of love. It was a relic of silence, and silence doesn't heal. It just buries the truth deeper. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard, where Lena had started planting herbs that afternoon. Basil, mint, thyme, little green shoots pushing through dark soil. Life coming back. I thought about Richard's words, about Cycles about testimony, about the terrifying power of speaking plainly. He hurt me. I saw it. It wasn't right. My mother never got to say those words, but Lena might. And if Richard, of all people, was willing to say them too, then maybe the house wouldn't fall this time. Maybe it could finally stand. I slipped the ring back into its box and closed the lid. Not to hide it, just to honor it for what it was. A reminder that love without truth is just another kind of prison. And we were done living behind bars. That night, I didn't dream of raised voices or slammed doors. I dreamed of open windows, fresh air, and a table where no one had to flinch to be fed. Lena didn't say a word at breakfast the next morning. She just slid her phone across the table. A text from Daniel. "If you don't come home, I'll tell everyone you're unstable. I'll get custody of the baby before it's even born." The words hit like ice water down my spine. I looked up at her. Her face. Pale, lips pressed tight, hands gripping the edge of the table like she might float away if she let go. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the soft clink of my coffee cup as I set it down. My stomach dropped. Baby. I'd known she was pregnant, but hearing him use it as a threat, like a weapon, made it real in a way I hadn't let myself feel yet. She was 3 months pregnant, just starting to show, just beginning to wonder what kind of mother she'd be, and he was already trying to steal that future from her. I felt the world tilt, not just for her, but for that tiny life growing inside her, innocent, vulnerable, already caught in his web of control. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive to his office and make him look me in the eye while I read those words back to him. But I stayed still, because this wasn't about my anger. It was about her next breath. She didn't cry. Not then. She just stared at the screen like it might burst into flame. After a long silence, her fingers moved again. She tapped once, twice, then turned the phone toward me. Another message, this one older, unsent, buried in her drafts. A photo, grainy, taken in low light, but clear. Enough. An open journal, leather-bound, the kind teenage boys keep under their beds. The page was filled with angry, scribbled handwriting. "Weak women think they can talk back," it read. "They don't know their place. Someone should teach them what punishment feels like." It was signed, DM, age 16. My breath caught. Daniel's journal. From high school. She'd found it in the attic, she said quietly, voice barely above a whisper. He never threw it out, just tucked it away like it was nothing. I looked at her, really looked. There was no shock in her eyes anymore, no confusion, just a cold, steady clarity. She'd been documenting everything, not just the bruises, not just the threats, but his pattern, his history, his truth. And now she had proof that this wasn't stress, wasn't a bad night, wasn't something that could be fixed with therapy. This was who he'd always been, and who he'd always be unless someone stopped him. I didn't tell her what to do. Didn't say, "You should go to the police," or "This is your chance." I just asked, "What do you want to do with it?" She looked out the window for a long time. A bird landed on the feeder I'd hung last spring, pecked at seeds, flew. Off. "I need to show someone," she finally said. "Not just you, someone who can make it matter." Her voice wasn't shaky anymore. It was quiet, deliberate, like she'd crossed a line inside herself and couldn't go back. I nodded. "Then I'll drive you." She didn't say yes right away, just closed her eyes for a second, like she was gathering every ounce of courage she had left. When she opened them, there was something new there. Fear, yes, but beneath it, a flicker of resolve. "Okay," she said. "Today." We finished our coffee in silence. I washed the dishes. She went to her room and came back, wearing jeans and a loose sweater, hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked younger, or maybe just more real, like she'd stopped pretending. And in that moment I knew, this wasn't the start of her bravery. It was the moment she finally trusted it. The police station was only 10 minutes away, but the drive felt endless. Lena sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance. We both knew what this meant. Once she walked in, there was no pretending it hadn't happened. No going back to, he's just stressed, or it was my fault. This was real, permanent, dangerous. When we pulled into the lot, she didn't move right away. What if they don't believe me? She asked, voice small. What if they say it's just words from a journal, that the texts could be taken out of context? Then we show them the bruises, I said. We show them the photos. We show them the pattern. She nodded slowly, took a deep breath, opened the door. I followed her, not ahead, not behind, right beside her. Not as a savior, not as a mother figure with all the answers, just as proof that she wasn't alone, that someone saw her, believed her, would stand with her no matter what happened next. Inside, the station was colder than I expected. Fluorescent lights, linoleum floors, the smell of stale coffee and old paper. A young officer at the front desk looked up when we approached. "Can I help you?" Lena hesitated. I didn't speak for her. This had to be her voice. After a few seconds, she straightened her shoulders and said, "I'd like to file a report. Domestic abuse, threats, and I have evidence." The officer led us to a small room with 2 chairs and a metal desk. A woman in plain clothes, Detective Ruiz, her badge said, came in a few minutes later. She didn't rush Lena, didn't interrupt, just listened as Lena spoke, her voice gaining strength with every sentence. She showed the texts, the journal photo, the time-stamped bruises on her arm. She told them about the hair pulling, the surveillance cameras, the way he'd isolate her from friends, from me. And when she mentioned the baby, her hand went to her stomach without thinking. Detective Ruiz didn't flinch, didn't doubt, just nodded and said, "Thank you for coming forward. This matters." Lena didn't cry, but her eyes filled, relief, fear, exhaustion, all tangled together. And in that moment, I knew. She hadn't walked in here because she was suddenly fearless. She'd walked in because, for the first time, she believed someone would believe her. We left the station an hour later. The sun was higher, the air warmer. Lena walked slower, like she'd carried something heavy out of that building and left it behind. She didn't say much on the drive home, just stared out the window, fingers resting lightly on her belly. When we pulled into the driveway, she turned to me and said, "He's going to know. He's going to be furious." "Then let him be," I said. "His anger doesn't get to live in this house anymore." She nodded, a small, tired smile touching her lips. Not joy, not yet, but something close to peace. That night, she ate a full meal for the first time in weeks. She even laughed at something on TV, soft, hesitant, but real. And as I washed the dishes later, I thought about the woman who'd walked into that steakhouse just days ago, shoulders hunched, voice quiet, trying to disappear. She was still here. Bruised, yes. Scared, maybe, but no longer silent. And that, more than anything, was the real turning point. Not the report, not the evidence, but the moment she chose to trust her own truth. And I'd been right there beside her, not to fix her, but to witness her becoming whole again. Daniel didn't go to trial. His lawyer called early that morning, calm, polite, like he was offering a discount on a car instead of closing the door on years of abuse. "Plea deal," he said. "Anger management, a permanent restraining order, full custody to Lena. Supervised visits only if the child ever requests them, and only after turning 18. I handed the phone to Lena, who sat in the kitchen nook with her hands wrapped around a cooling mug of tea, her belly round under a soft cotton shirt. She listened without speaking, her expression unreadable. When she hung up, she just stared out the window at the oak tree in the backyard, its leaves trembling in the wind like they knew something big was coming. "I don't want him to get off easy," she finally said, voice low. "He should sit in a courtroom. He should have to look at what he did and hear it called what it is." I didn't argue. I just sat across from her and waited, because I knew this wasn't really about the law. It was about the weight she'd carried, the nights she'd lain awake wondering if anyone would ever believe her. And now, the chance to force him to face it was slipping away. She paced the living room all afternoon, barefoot on the hardwood, fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. "I want him to suffer," she admitted, voice breaking. "Like I suffered Like I cried myself to sleep, wondering if I was crazy. Like I flinched every time a door slammed. I nodded. That's fair. But it's not just about me anymore, she whispered, one hand resting on her belly. That's when it shifted. The baby moved, just a soft roll inside her, and she stopped walking. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach and closed her eyes like she was listening to something only she could hear. I don't want my child growing up watching me hate, she said, so quiet I almost missed it. Hate is a heavy thing to carry. I don't want him to learn that love means keeping score of pain. I watched her shoulders relax, not because she was over it, but because she'd made a choice. Not for Daniel, not for the court, but for the tiny life growing inside her. She wasn't letting go of justice. She was redefining it, not as punishment, but as peace. The signing was scheduled for Thursday at the courthouse. We got there early, just Lena and me. She wore a simple dress, her hair loose, no makeup, nothing to hide behind. She didn't wear long sleeves for the first time since she'd come to me. The sun hit her arms, pale but unmarked now, and I saw how her skin glowed. Not because the bruises were gone, but because she finally believed she deserved to be seen. We sat in the quiet waiting area, papers stacked neatly in a manila, folder on her lap. I held her hand, not because she needed me to, but because I needed her to know I was there. And then, Daniel didn't show. His lawyer came alone, polite, efficient, and handed over a sealed envelope along with the final documents. He asked me to give this to you, he said, not meeting Lena's eyes. She took it without a word. Back in the car, she opened it. Inside, written in that same controlled handwriting she used to fear, "You'll regret choosing her over me." No signature. Just those words, sharp and cold like a blade wrapped in silk. She read it once, then handed it to me without a word. I didn't say anything. I just drove us home, the letter folded on the dashboard like a dead thing. When we got to the backyard, I pulled out the old metal bucket I used for burning garden waste. Lena stood beside me, arms crossed over her belly, watching as I lit the match. The paper curled at the edges, blackened, turned to ash, and disappeared into smoke. She didn't look away, didn't cry, just watched the flames eat the words until there was nothing left but gray. "He thinks regret is something you choose," she said finally, "but it's something you live with, and I'm done living in his version of my life." I put my arm around her, and for the first time, she leaned into it, not like she needed saving, but like she wanted to share the weight for just a moment. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, and I realized we weren't just burning a letter. We were burning the last thread that tied her to his control. That night, after dinner, Lena took a long bath, something she hadn't done since she arrived, always too tense, too alert to relax in water. I heard her humming softly from the bathroom, just a few notes, but enough to make my chest tighten. When she came out, her hair damp, skin warm from the steam, she wore her favorite cotton pajamas, the ones with little stars, and crawled into bed without checking the locks 3 times like she used to. I left her door open a crack, like always, and went to my own room. Hours later, I passed by on my way to the kitchen for water, and I saw her through the sliver of light from the hallway, curled on her side, one arm around her belly, breathing slow and deep. No whimpering, no sudden jerks awake, no silent tears in the dark. She was sleeping, really sleeping. For the first time in months, maybe years, she wasn't braced for danger in her dreams. She wasn't waiting for the next blow, the next cruel word, the next humiliation. She was just resting. And in that moment, I understood something I'd missed before. Justice doesn't always come with a verdict. Sometimes it comes in the quiet space between breaths, in the trust that the night won't bring harm, in the simple act of closing your eyes and knowing you're safe. I stood there in the hallway for a long time, watching her sleep, feeling the weight of everything we'd survived settle into something softer, something like hope. Daniel had wanted her to regret leaving, but she hadn't. She'd chosen her child. She'd chosen peace. She'd chosen herself. and that was more powerful than any courtroom sentence. I went back to my room, left the light off, and lay in bed listening to the house, the hum of the fridge, the wind. In the trees, the steady rhythm of 2 heartbeats down the hall, one strong, one still forming. And I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new one where love didn't leave bruises, where safety wasn't a secret, where a woman could stop flinching at her own shadow, not because the past disappeared, but because she finally believed she was worth more than the fear that once defined her, and that, more than any gavel, more than any verdict, was true justice. I watched Lena kneel in the backyard last week, hands deep in the soil, planting marigolds, the same flowers my mother used to grow along the edge of our old porch. The sun was warm, but not harsh, the kind of late spring light that feels like a promise. Lena wore a loose cotton shirt with short sleeves, her arms bare for the first time since she'd walked into my life. No long sleeves to hide bruises, no flinching when a bird startled from the bushes. Just her, the earth, and the quiet rhythm of her breathing as she pressed each seedling into the ground. Her belly was round now, firm, beneath the fabric, and she moved with a new kind of sureness. Not confidence exactly, but calm. Like she'd finally stopped bracing for the next blow and started believing she deserved softness. She didn't notice me at first, so I stood by the back door and just watched, my chest tight with something. That wasn't sadness or even joy, but relief. Deep, bone-level relief that she was still here, still choosing life, still planting flowers instead of pretending the ground wasn't soaked in pain. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt, and finally looked up. "You're staring," she said, but she wasn't teasing, just stating it like it was a fact as ordinary as the sun or the soil. "I am," I admitted, stepping onto the patio. "You look peaceful." She smiled, not the tight, practiced smile from that restaurant night, but something real, small and soft at the corners of her eyes. "I feel it today," she said. "Not every day, but today." I crouched beside her, not too close, just near enough to share the quiet. "What are you planting?" "Marigolds," she said, patting the earth around a bright orange bloom. "They're tough, grow in almost anything. My grandma used to say they keep bad spirits away." I nodded. "My mother grew them too." We worked in silence for a while, me helping her space the plants, her humming under her breath, a tune I didn't know but that sounded like healing. Then, without looking up, she said, "I named her Clara." My breath caught, my breath. "After your mother?" She shook her head gently. "After the light I finally found in myself." The words settled between us like seeds dropped into good soil. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just true. She's back in school part-time now. Social work, 2 nights a week at the community college downtown. She takes the bus with her backpack slung over one shoulder, books on trauma-informed care peeking out the top. I drive her sometimes, but she insists on going alone more often than not. "I need to remember I can do things by myself," she told me last week, and I didn't argue. She's not just studying. She's volunteering at the Women's Center where we first sat in the parking lot for an hour. Now, she sits across from other women with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, not as someone who's been saved, but as someone who made it through and wants to hand them a rope. Last Tuesday, she came home late, tired but bright-eyed. "A woman stayed after the group," she said, stirring soup at the stove. She said my story made her believe she could leave too. She didn't say it like a victory, just like a fact, like planting marigolds, like showing up, like choosing to speak when silence used to feel safer. And when Daniel's name comes up, rarely, but it still does, she doesn't cry. She doesn't tense. She just says, "That chapter's closed." No bitterness, no longing, just finality, like turning a page you never need to reread. I still keep my mother's quilt on the couch, the one I clutched that night at the steakhouse. But it's not for hiding anymore. Not for wrapping around myself like armor against memories. Now it's for wrapping around us, Lena and me, when the past shows up uninvited. Like last week when a car backfired on the street and she froze mid-sentence, hand flying to her belly. I didn't say anything, just reached for the quilt, draped it over both our shoulders, and waited. She leaned into me, just for a minute, then let out a long breath and kept talking about her professor's feedback on her latest paper. That's how it is now. The fear still visits. But it doesn't get to stay. We've made a home where it's okay to shake, as long as you keep breathing. Where silence isn't the default. It's a choice, not a cage. And sometimes, in the evenings, we sit on the back porch with the quilt over our legs, watching the marigolds catch the last light. And we don't need to say a word. The quiet between us isn't empty. It's full of everything we've survived and everything we're becoming. We're not healed. No one ever really is. Not completely. There are still nights when Lena wakes up gasping. Still moments when she hesitates before speaking. Still days when the weight of what she's lost presses heavy on her chest. And I carry my own ghosts. The years I stayed quiet, the times I mistook endurance for strength. But we're free. Not because the scars are gone, but because they don't control us anymore. We walk through the house with the windows open. Let the breeze carry away the stale air of old fears. We laugh louder than we used to, not because the pain is gone, but because joy isn't the opposite of pain. It's the companion that shows up anyway. Lena talks about Clara like she's already here. She'll love the garden. Or, I hope she has your stubbornness. And I can see it. A little girl growing up in a house where love doesn't leave bruises, where a woman's voice isn't something to be managed or muffled, but honored. And for the first time in my life, I know that silence isn't peace. It's surrender. I spent decades believing that keeping quiet was the price of family, of love, of being good. But real peace isn't bought with obedience. It's built with truth, with boundaries, with the courage to say no, even when your hands are shaking. I'm done surrendering, done pretending, done shrinking so others can feel big. Lena taught me that just as much as I tried to help her, maybe more, we've planted more than marigolds in this backyard. We've planted a new kind of life, one where roots grow deep not because the ground was easy, but because we refuse to stop tending it. And when Clara is born, she'll know, before she knows anything else, that she belongs to a line of women who learned finally to speak. Not perfectly, not loudly every time, but truthfully. And that's enough. That's everything. Friends, thank you so much for listening to my story until the end. Your presence means more than you know. If this resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another real-life story of courage, survival, and healing. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, and know that your voice matters here. I'm so grateful for your support, and I hope you'll explore more stories like this one on the channel, because none of us have to walk through pain alone. With love and respect, thank you for being here.